And they wanted me to be a rabbi. What can I tell you? And why not? All right, moving on. My wife is much more versed in scripture than I am. And let's get back, because you saw, if you were looking, I was looking at this. I think this COVID PowerPoint that comes with a textbook, it is, of course, Brooke. What's going on is that this is more relevant when we get to the respiratory disease aspect. And I'll frame it when we do go over as to what my opinion is and what they're presenting to you here. Understand, a lot, to a certain extent, textbooks have to present what we call the company line. They want universities to buy their textbook. And so, and COVID is a very, very controversial, but I'll just kind of give you the basics before we get into the respiratory disease aspect of things. So with that said, let's begin kind of where we left off, which was over here. I realize it's redundant, but it's important that this is kind of where we were. You might remember I talked a little bit about rubella. Rubella is spread respiratorily, even though it presents on your skin. Minor virus, enveloped, easy to get rid of on surfaces. The problem is you're already transmitting this before you realize you're sick. And the problem with it historically was pregnant women. I mean, you'd start to cough or sneeze and be next to somebody who was pregnant, and all of a sudden, I didn't even know they were pregnant. And the next thing you know, it's first trimester, and we're dealing with significant problems. That's why otherwise would they make a vaccine for a relatively innocuous thing that's probably no worse than a bad cold. And frankly, that's the truth. You get to it. You get some swollen glands behind your ears. You get a little bit of a rash here, 101, 102 fever. You might not even miss school or work because of that. Yet the risk to the unborn child. These are again, non-life-threatening respiratory viruses. You feel very ill. We heard about this. It was coming. They found it in mosquitoes that were coming from Africa, and a lot of times this is where it happened basically on ships that were dropping off supplies in the islands. The mosquitoes would just fly off the boat or the ship, and they had this. And the next thing you know, you're transmitting it to another area of the world. I mean, that's one of the things that does happen worldwide with some of these viruses. There's chikungunya. Not a big deal for you to know about at this point unless you're in an area where it's relevant. These are much more relevant, and certainly nothing more than hepatitis C. Okay, most of these are where rubella is respiratory and chikungunya is zoonotic. Yellow fever, dengue, Zika, as far as we know, are all zoonotic, and typically it's mosquitoes. It's the old story: control the vector, control the disease, versus hepatitis C, which is clearly blood, body fluid, sexually transmitted, whatever. And when we were going to see, you might remember me saying this, when we start talking about viruses that become long-term or chronic, that's really a problem, because then it's something where you're at great risk of being infected if you come into contact with it. And just again, I reiterate the point with my first wife. Did she get it from a transfusion back in 81? Possibly. Did they not notice it until 2004 when she had a blood splatter and she was trying to draw bloods in a nursing home patient? It came up, didn't wear glasses. So, I mean, the membranes in your eyes are where a lot of these things, COVID notwithstanding, is another one of those things that get in that way. That's a portal of entry. People don't realize it, but it is. And maybe that's what happened with her. I do not know. So that's part of it, which brings us to the aforementioned COVID. It's an oddball. It's genetically, it's more similar to influenza viruses than you would think. Okay, the problem with, as you're going to see with RSV, influenza, and in general with RNA viruses, is the ability to mutate. Coronaviruses have been around for a very long time. Corona means crown. And it just has to do with the envelope having that crown. You can see the illustrations at that other PowerPoint. Now I'm going to make sure I find some way to get it to you, even though I have to almost copy and paste it to get it there. And we've had, so they are typically a cold virus. They're comparatively minor. They'll even comment on that in that PowerPoint. there have been at least 3 that we are aware of significance. The severity of the significance is not necessarily a topic for today. First time we heard about something called SARS being severe acute respiratory syndrome was immediately post 9/11, and we thought it was a bioterror attack. That 9/11 was a terrorist attack. Then you had, and then within a year after that, all of a sudden, it turned out a bunch of folks on an airplane coming from Tokyo on their way to someplace to either Toronto or Montreal, and all of a sudden they were dying of this severe respiratory illness. And it was called SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, later identified as a coronavirus. And COVID just means coronavirus, that's all. Okay, 19, as you could see in that PowerPoint, then it was identified in 19. Nothing special about that. And so how it was studied and found to be just an incidental finding that unfortunately someone who had an acute presentation and that got on a plane is a very controlled environment. A lot of people get sick post-plane travel, as you know, particularly when they're on it for a long period of time, okay, and effectively managed were a way of transporting it vis-a-vis worldwide travel to another location. Okay, it was not any type of terrorist type of attack, but understand this virus undergoes a very interesting phenomena that we're going to look at toward the latter portion of the chapter, and in respiratory diseases called antigenic shift and drift. That's how these viruses mutate, and understand that they affect a lot of the fact that it's a virus. We have to talk about the range. And again, the range is the number of species. And COVID, like influenza, can target a lot of members of the bird family, a lot of members of the pig family, a lot of members of the human family, a lot of members of the bat family. They're all mammals. And because of that, every so often, when you have a farm, or perhaps in COVID, a case of a laboratory, you have a confluence of factors that are going on where this virus can undergo a kind of mutation that you're going to learn about called antigenic shift. And effectively, you get what we call a novel, N-O-V-E-L, meaning new, never encountered before virus. The worst virus in mankind, from a standpoint, the greatest killer of infectious disease in mankind, was an influenza virus, which was called the Spanish flu, which is an avian flu, and you hear a lot about that. It just meant that some bird RNA virus got into human RNA virus, created something that created an extraordinary problem vis-a-vis our immune system. That's kind of what happened. And then we saw conservative estimates, 125 million people back in 1918, 1919 died. And a lot of young, healthy individuals, which is not unlike a lot of what we saw with COVID, where it's understand with viruses, what kills you is the immunological response, not anything else other than that. So we'll start with that. So that then later, and we found another variation of this in the same family that was a COVID type of virus called MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. And this was particularly found during one of the Desert Storm type campaigns, 08, 09. And as you might guess, because people harbor it, it comes back into this country. Were they as dangerous as quote unquote COVID-19, at least not to our reckoning of it? And then lastly, and the one, again, I'd rather talk about it in respiratory diseases. But as far as we know, they're all spread respiratorily. Does that preclude getting it from being on a surface? Probably. I think there was a lot of misinformation about that. Oh my God. I don't want to go near anybody. I've never seen so many gloves and masks and people wrapped up like crazy. I mean, the response to that, and this is again my feeling, my opinion, was so over the top and inaccurate. It cost more lives than saved. And I will say this again and again. Why folks, young, healthy individual like you, who surely would have survived this, okay, we're subject to immunizations and subject to not being in school and all that stuff, is beyond imagination. Beyond. Don't understand. I think it set back a lot of things in our country for a long period of time. Just saying. My opinion, not fact. Understand, whenever I'm just presenting you with information, it's my opinion, I will always express it. It's framed as my opinion. So, take it for what it's worth. I'm no virology expert. I just have the task of explaining to you what went on with some viruses. More on that down the road. You'll get my philosophy. Moving on. Okay, so they're respiratory. They're typically spread respiratorily. They have the potential to be very severe, and they have the potential, certainly, whether engineered to do so or randomly doing so, to present something very dangerous to us. Whether we have to make a vaccine every time there's a variation, don't think so, but that's me. Moving on. So that's in a unique structure, not isometric or not filamentous like either of these two. The filamentous virus is the most famous since the first virus we saw with rabies. When I learned virology from the lead virologist in the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania way back 50 years ago, he went up on the board and he drew this. This is pretty much what we think is a virus. Kind of has a protein shell and some kind of genetic material. The one we could identify first was rabies. And we had a very generic discussion about what actual viruses, learned a lot about it, but that's what we were looking at. He was basically drawing a rabies virus. He didn't have the technology or the ability to be able to identify the strandedness and the shapes and the nature of the envelopes, whether present or not. So it was called rhabdovirus and rabies. Rabies, by definition, is zoonotic. It means that it's typically brought to you by a member of the animal kingdom. As I've said already a couple of times, it doesn't preclude human-to-human transfer. And there are enough, as well as one that I'm familiar with, that I told you about, there's enough anecdotal cases for it. So for many of you talking about nursing, that's another thing. Without even getting into the legalities of it, but you assume a certain amount of risk when you're there. Okay? So, you have to exercise a certain amount of due care and understand that if you get infected while you're there, yeah, there's workman's comp and all that stuff, but there's a certain amount of risk that's attendant as well. You're doing these things. You're on the firing lines. You're running sick people, and you get sick. Just saying. So that's what we know about rabies, as much as I can tell you. The problem is rabies is fatal. So when someone is exposed, years ago, there was a series of injections that you got daily over a 2-week period that were given intraperitoneal, intra-abdominally. And the pain was historically almost intolerable. It drove them crazy to get these. Fortunately, of late, they have improved, and because you're just getting antibodies, you're getting antiviral antibodies. There's no magical vaccine or anything else for humans. For animals, different story. Just like my dog and my cats have had, rabies prophylaxis. Okay, people don't. Who are at risk for this mostly, and when do you hear about veterinarians and people working for veterinarians, people working in animal shelters? And understand it's a limited amount of immunity. You're going to learn about that in A&P. It's called passive immunity, meaning the fact that you were exposed, okay, whether you're given the immunity temporarily by some type of antibody in this case, or it was passed on to you naturally by your mom when you're born for 6 months. After about 6 months, it's not there anymore, which means the fact that you were bitten once as a veterinarian or someone who works around animals, 6 months later you're bitten again, and unless we have proof positive that the animal has not had rabies prophylaxis, guess what? You're getting that series of shots, but thankfully they're not nearly as painful. It's about 7 days worth of immunizations. I beg your pardon, wrong term. 7 of treatment shots with antibodies. That's basically the way it works. So at least we have treatment. A disease, when I first started teaching micro 20 years ago, and this is another filament, is Ebola. There's another one called Marburg, which is in the same category. Probably they are the same, just subtle mutations. When I first started teaching this, we taught it saying that people who were infected had likely an 80% or so fatality rate. How's that? 8 out of 10 people, 4 out of 5 individuals who get it die. It had never, at that time, we had never had a case in this country. Since then, about what, 5, 6 years ago, we had a case with Doctors Without Borders who were treating in West Africa along the Atlantic Ocean, Liberia, I'm trying to think, Ivory Coast, that area. They had a very severe outbreak in about 3 of these small countries in that area. And he had, and he wasn't the only one, he had contracted it, and they were assured of an effort trying to bring him back, even though he had active disease, to certain facilities that felt they could treat it. The problem with Ebola is how rapidly it spreads. It used to be classified as zoonotic. We thought we got it from contaminated water or close contact with an animal, typically fouling the water supply, certainly bitten, that type of thing. And it was typically confined to certain provinces or certain small countries in Africa, typically Central Africa. Unfortunately, what kind of surfaced was we didn't know everything about it, to the point where people would go in and treat these patients. These were hospitals, typically dirt floor hospitals. They were still hospitals. People were getting good treatment. They just weren't a hospital like you and I are familiar with. You'd have to wear almost like an encounter suit, in the sense that you were completely covered, and it was so hot that you probably could go 40 or 50 minutes. When you came out, okay, you needed, the decontamination procedure was so extensive that you needed like 2 people to help you decontaminate. You had one person reading to you the exact way what you were to take off and how. Okay, it couldn't be like, I'm going to get this stupid head thing off my mask, my face is killing me, get this gown off, I'm dying of heat. No. You had to do it in a specific order, not to self-contaminate from the exposure to all those patients. Imagine that. So you had someone making sure you were doing it right, someone reading you out the instructions, someone washing it down with whatever disinfectants they were using. How's that? And what happened and one hospital in Texas said, oh, we can handle it. And they had another patient who came in. One of the nurses became infected with Ebola. The first case came from somebody in the United States who had not been overseas. Okay. And she was majorly ill. I do not believe she succumbed to it. They had someone who came over on a plane who had active disease, wasn't screened properly, or was allowed to travel. And the whole story. That doctor did okay with it. So understand, now we have an idea of how it spread. We have a better idea of treatment availability. I do not know that what specifically they use vis-a-vis antivirals or treatment for this, but now with good treatment, they're reducing the fatality rate to probably under 50%. It's still scary. I mean, they've written techno thrillers about this. The late Tom Clancy, who wrote the Jack Ryan books, wrote a techno thriller about this 30 years ago, about a weaponized form of a virus like this that was made aerosolized so it could be respiratory. Just to give you some idea, these are the kinds of things that for me are fun to read about, but a lot of people have nasty intent. So understand there's a lot here about this. And so the reason I'm sharing it with you in this context is to make you aware of some of the risks that you're going to have. I mean, it sort of dovetails off, and I don't mean to be yelling at you guys or anything like that. I'm just be overly serious first thing on a Monday. I'm not trying to do this. But you picked a field where there's a bunch of sick people. Okay, and there's a whole bunch of laws about sick people, and there's a whole bunch of licensing issues about this. It's a freaking minefield. And if you're not aware of them, they bite you right in the rear end. Trying to be polite. Try to remember that. All right. So much for that sermon about that. So Ebola, filamentous, spread is not terribly clear. Danger very much. Rabies, classically zoonotic. We always have to say that. And it is. And it's around us all the time. So while there is rabies, at least there is treatment if it's caught properly. What rabies does is it damages effectively your brain. It damages nervous system cells, and for years, sometimes the only way they found out about it was post-mortem, when they see characteristic changes in the brain associated with it. People were unaware of it. They don't always have that classic foaming in the mouth type of stuff and all of that that's going on. I mean, a lot of that is just this old time stuff. Which brings us to these two players, mumps and influenza. They are called, myxo means mucus. So these are respiratory spread. And there's some really big time players in this. Para means alongside, and ortho means straight. Not a big deal because we're not really looking at the strandedness. I'll tell you more about it with influenza. So these are both classified probably as pleiform, meaning that it's really not filamentous or isometric. It's not clear what it is. There are four members of the category, all respiratorily spread in paramyxo. A couple of them are fairly famous and very topical. Measles, that's the topical one. Measles, mumps. These are both respiratory diseases. This typically manifests itself in the skin, classically catalyzes a skin virus with all these red spots. You guys were all immunized, I'm sure, with that MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella. Okay, but if you're like me, we all have measles as kids. Okay, and comparably mild, but potentially life-threatening. We'll talk about that in skin diseases. And it's not just confined to the skin. Say it again and again. It's the third largest killer in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, why don't they take the measles immunization? Because they don't trust it. That's well because a failed attempt at polio vaccine is probably the source for what you and I call HIV. Where did HIV come from? A really shoddy, criminal effort, and there's a lot of documentary evidence of quote-unquote labs. Lab is the wrong term. Okay, of a company trying to do it very much on the cheap to make polio virus that probably was inadvertently, I don't believe intentionally, just stupidly created HIV. A lot of information about it, all over the place. Mumps, again, another one of these we call the usual childhood diseases: measles, mumps, German measles, and chicken pox. I only had 3 of those. I didn't have the mumps. I later got the immunization for mumps when we were getting married and wanted to have kids. And just, as a precaution, okay, and then, after that immunization, we were told for 3 months not, to use whatever prophylactic measures just in case. Mumps manifests itself in your salivary glands, which classifies it as a gastrointestinal virus. Both of these much worse when you're adults. We'll get to all of those. The other one is called parainfluenza. It's a mild flu-like presentation. And the last one you hear a whole lot about, very topical now, RSV, respiratory syncytial virus. And you all did heart anatomy. What's a syncytial? You did the heart? Yeah, right? All the cells. They are a syncytial. They're all fused together. One big network of cells. Very useful if you're the heart, because they all beat together. Okay? One beats and all the rest of them sequentially beat, right? You just did the anatomy part, you didn't do the phys part at all. Didn't talk about electrocardiograms or any of that. Look at it. It's called a syncytium. That's a fusion of cells. Imagine if you have cells in your lung all fused together. Not good. Includes breathing adequately. So this virus is a remarkable respiratory virus which typically didn't affect us very much as adults, but inevitably it's mutated. So RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, biggest problem was was this. We saw it in respiratory infantile, and probably even more so neonatal, infantile respiratory distress. Children born preemies or with other difficulties don't make something called surfactant. Surfactant is something that you don't start to generate until about 26 weeks of gestation. That baby, in the intrauterine environment. That is a wetting agent. What surfactants is, it makes the lung cells slide over one each other so they can easily expand and contract. When cells in the lung can't do that, they stick together and they have trouble reinflating or inflating at all. So when a baby is born prematurely, this is one of the things you see in neonatal ICU that's as scary as anything. We now can manufacture the surfactant, and it facilitates preemies even 23 to 24 weeks. I mean, unheard of. In the palm of your hand kind of premature. Okay, that tiny, being able to survive under the right circumstances. This is where McGee would be 101 about this. McGee would. So understand that's a very severe, and now we're seeing it tremendously. It's part of what we call the big three. People are worried about coronaviruses still. There were the variety of COVID variants, even though they've gotten milder over time. COVID, influenza, and RSV. Those are the three. When you go to urgent care with something that seems like, quote, flu-like symptoms, they're going to test you for all three. And that is RSV. That's the fourth one of that particular category, and really important. Okay, like many of these viruses, when they're severe, it's typically the very young and the very old who are most affected. Most of us who are healthy, not a big deal. But it can be pretty scary. So they're all respiratorily spread. We deal more about them going on, and that brings us to influenza. There's different types of influenza. And this is the only virus that I really, and it's very misunderstood. You have influenza A, B, and C, and the one you really always test for, like in urgent care or in the hospital, is influenza A. The other ones are cured. Influenza is the only one with strandedness. It has 7 to 8 single strands of RNA. What makes it such a pain to deal with is every time that it replicates, and it replicates all the time, what happens, so you might have it, and while it's inside of you replicating, you get little pieces kind of change places. That's a phenomenon called antigenic drift. And what that does is it creates effectively different viruses. Was what the shifting of those segments, and shift is the wrong term, the movement of those segments, because shifting confuses the issue, because there's something called antigenic shift we will get to down the road. But I'm just trying to give you an idea, some context where the drifting or the movement of those segments creates effectively a slightly different virus. Which means if you got the flu shot for this one, okay, that one is now changed. What's this all about? So here we got a handful of those. Here's the virus. Okay, how does it attach? Influenza has protein spikes. Protein spikes alternate. One's that attach, and there's one that help it escape. So I've drawn it that way. It's three-dimensional. It's all over the exterior of the cell. They have great names. One is called hemagglutinin. Okay. That's how it attaches to the host cell. The other one's called neuraminidase. pigs. That's how it eventually escapes from the host cell, was more havoc in your respiratory system. It's a pain to keep saying hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, so we just call them H and N. So every time an influenza comes out, for instance, in your flu shot, if you happen to get one, inevitably, the most common one is called H1N1. Is that a term you've heard before? So we've identified, well, at least, I don't know, about 15 plus H's, at least 9 N's from different species. So when you hear about one of these, oh my God, influenza, the swine flu, okay, that Spanish flu, which is a bird flu, that what happens is you get sort of an interesting combination. Most people erroneously thought that that terrible Spanish flu back in 1918, 1919 was H1N1. Most of the evidence that I've read about it suggests it's H5N1. Not that that matters a whit. Doesn't matter at all. What it underscores is when we begin to get changes like this drifting phenomenon, okay, it begins to subtly alter these markers. And that's how vaccines, that's how our antibodies attack them. They don't know any better. Basically, an antibody or a vaccine, and the vaccine encourages your body to produce antibodies, attaches to those spikes. If the spike is like this, it attaches to it. If the spike is all of a sudden changed and has this, it doesn't attach anymore. It's all about the shape. That's what proteins are. Nothing else matters. So why didn't that flu shot help me? Because flus mutate all the time. And people have a great misunderstanding about influenza. I mean, how many students do I get? Oh, I got the flu. I'll be back Wednesday. If you got the flu, you're not coming back Wednesday. The influenza A, 7 to 10 days. You are unbelievably ill. You're flat on your back in bed. Everything hurts. Your immune system's going crazy. You can hardly breathe. Your stomach's killing you. Every time you sit up, you're dizzy. That's influenza. Understand, back in the day, they used to call it the grip, GRIPPE. I mean, I remember my dad. I couldn't even remember until the day he died. For 40 years, one day he was sick. The one time he was sick was for a week. He had the grip. He got it probably back in 1968. There was an influenza outbreak that was very severe. It's the only time I saw this immensely strong man, other than until he succumbed to heart disease, okay, for 40 years sick at all. It's just, it boggles the mind how ill people are when these flu, and we'll go over this again. I'm just trying to underscore how important it is to understand this stuff. It really is. Now, some exotic ones. So respiratory, Hanta, respiratory. Hanta is dangerous. Hanta is, we don't see it around here because it is spread typically by rodent droppings. And rodent droppings become aerosolized. Where do we see it? Desert Southwest. I mean, other than being in certain parts of Africa where it's named from, what happens is when you have a large amount of rodents and you're in a dusty environment, it's easy for those things to stay in the air and linger. Have you ever traveled or vacationed into the desert areas in outside of in California, Arizona, New Mexico, all that area? Dust all around. I mean, remember us going in the Mojave Desert, which is where Palm Springs is, and going to was it Jericho Tree National Park, something out in that same area. Oh my gosh, you're going through dust clouds constantly. They come up out of nowhere. They are filled with these kinds of viruses sometimes, and people get this all the time. There's other diseases too we're talking about respiratorily. So the only time we see occasional cases, say in Pennsylvania, are people who are cultivating, I don't know if that's the right term, rodents for medical experimentation for labs. Okay, or in areas where where there's very poor rodent control in the inner city. That's about it. So you don't see it, but it is potentially fatal disease, high fever, nasty. People are very familiar. If you end up going to live your life and work professionally in that Southwest, you'll learn about Hanta. You'll learn about something called valley fever, which is a fungal infection. We cover that a little bit in this as well. And that's purely respiratory, but that's very interesting and very potentially very dangerous. I don't do Lassa. Hepatitis B we're immunized for. We used to think it was strictly a DNA. We now know it has retrovirus capabilities. But because everybody's immunized, I don't really spend a lot of time. And I'll spend the last 10 minutes or so on human immunodeficiency virus. Oops, sorry. So it's a retrovirus. What do we mean by that? I touched on it a little before. We know it's spread a number of ways, but potentially the most common way it's spread is by close contact, blood, and body fluids, saliva. We don't understand it as well. It's really an unusual virus in the sense you have a fairly standard looking virus if you want to look at it. It's an isometric virus that's developed. What we think happened. This is what I alluded to before. Years ago, in the 1960s early, some company was engaged by one of the World Health Organizations. I do not know which one. I've seen documentaries about this. And they were trying to build a, quote, lab on the cheap, only way to describe it, in Equatorial Africa, in the Congo, someplace like that. So what happens is they were growing the polio virus in monkeys and harvesting it and to be able to construct this vaccine. Understand what vaccines are made of. They were, at the time, making that what they call attenuated viruses. So basically you're getting an injection of the virus, which is what you get if you did not know, that has been altered to provoke your immune system but not make you sick. Trouble was, they didn't use healthy monkeys. It was a place that had stacks and stacks of squalor type conditions, dirt floor. It's a laboratory. Monkeys, they picked any monkey that would grow in, whether they were monkeys were sick or not, didn't matter. Stacked the cages on top. The sanitary conditions were non-existent. You getting a picture? So what they think happened was they were injecting these monkeys with one RNA virus. In the meantime, they had another virus. And what happens is some magical thing for the bad happened, and all of a sudden we developed a new virus called human immunodeficiency virus. Effectively, you had a virus that had, so we'll just draw it like that. It's an enveloped virus. The spikes are on the outside. It had RNA in the middle, but what happened was it contained a variety of, and it's not unusual for viruses to have additional proteins in them, basically in the form of enzymes. And one of them was called, we have named it RNA reverse transcriptase. What it means is basically it takes the RNA and it rewrites it as DNA. And then that DNA expresses itself as messenger RNA and eventually makes new viruses in the form of having new viruses of RNA, new capsid proteins, okay, new spike proteins, new enzymes. It's good news and bad news. It's a very complicated, what we call transcription strategy, how it's made. It means there's lots of ways to attack it. That's the good news. The bad news is it's the worst of both worlds, is the way I frame it. RNA viruses mutate. This step here RNA becoming DNA. In our cells, there's no proofreading that goes on. So mutations occur extraordinarily frequently here. Yeah. The other thing, so RNA viruses mutate. Now that you've made it into a DNA virus, it incorporates with the cell. Unfortunately, the cell that it infects is the single most important cell in your whole immune system, okay, called the helper T cell. We'll get to this in A and P. It's the one cell in your immune system that supports all the others. Without it being healthy, your immune system collapses. And what happens over time with this virus, if it's untreated or undertreated, or for some reason not treated, or not discovered in a sufficient amount of time, or people do not seek treatment, or however you want to phrase it, what happens is your immune system collapses. And you go from being HIV positive, which means you've been exposed to the virus and have antibodies to it, to be having AIDS, which means your immune system has collapsed and you're going to die sooner than later. That's the definition of fatal. That's the tragedy of this very, very unique and unusual disease. So that's what makes it so bad, this idea of being a retrovirus. It historically, it appeared, we think that this occurred, and then as people again travel, came from Africa, either immigrating to our country or countries in the rest of the world, or from people who work there or from physicians, wherever it got there, somehow, some way, this virus came. And mistakenly, people thought it was some scourge brought about to impact people who were gay men particularly, because that was, and we'll go into why that was a mistaken idea. And we really had no context for having not seen anything like this, an immunological collapse, other than some very, very rare conditions that were there. And I'll tell you about it long term, because I was on the forefront of it before we even had a name for HIV, before we even had a name called AIDS. Okay, that name didn't come about till 1981. I was a resident in Philadelphia. Okay, I went to school in Philadelphia for a period between 1973 and 1979. For the last 3 of those years, we were seeing AIDS patients. Okay, it was a tremendous impact. Proportionally, if you did not know, the 2 areas in the country that had the largest percentage of gay men were San Francisco and Philadelphia. Nothing else was even close. And we were extraordinarily close with a number of gay men, because they were, I think I told you this story. And if I didn't, I'm running out of time to tell you, but I'll give you the quick brief. When my first wife and I got engaged, and I basically moved in, I moved out of my apartment, moved into hers, and eventually moved to another apartment. She goes, I want you to understand, my downstairs neighbor is gay. And every so often I go out with him, because she was his date to the Christmas party. She was his date to the awards dinner in the office. He was this to this big function in any of the offices they had, because it was, you understand what it was like nearly 50 years ago. It was totally unaccepted. And so understand, and she went, I hope you don't mind. I said, oh, I'm fine. I don't think I'm worried about you going out with him permanently. Okay. You know, how, oh, you're such a lovely couple. When are you guys going to get engaged? Blah, 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 blah. He was a great dancer. She loved to dance. I have 2 left feet. That kind of thing. That's exactly what happened. And yet we became very, very friendly with his circle of friends. And I'm sitting there having lunch. We make big salads, have lots of fun cooking with 3 or 4 gay men who were, as I reflect on it, were succumbing in the process of succumbing to AIDS. All they said, oh, he's got it. He's sick. We were sure, because they knew it. We didn't have a word for it. I'll leave you with that. Thank you. Goodbye. Pay attention to your intro to nursing course. Well, now you're going to do well on the test. Oh.